chug, 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 chug,
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Wizard Staff Podcast. I'm your host, Blake.
And I'm Guy.
And we are two drunk novices who like to talk about EDH. We do drink and swear, so you've been warned. Please drink responsibly when playing children's card games. Tonight, we are going to be discussing treasures, whether or not they're good, bad, or somewhere in between for the Commander format. A lot of Commander content creators, you could say, have discussed this topic over the last couple months, I'd say, and I wanted to kind of sit down and actually listen to what everyone had to say and has been saying, and come to some sort of conclusion on our own on how we feel about treasures, because I haven't really spent the time to figure out what I think or feel about them, to be honest, and so that's what this episode is all about. We're just going to be discussing treasures. We're going to start with the history of treasures and kind of be more factual. Then we're going to move into a discussion about treasures. And then finally we're going to be discussing what the possible future of treasures could be or might be going forward.
Yeah, we'll definitely be giving you some real facts, then kind of going into our opinions, and then just some, I don't know what the good word is, but hypothesizing, I guess, what's to come in the future. Where do we think treasures can go?
But before all of that, we need to talk about what we're drinking tonight. So, Guy, what are you drinking?
I'm drinking coffee and Baileys. Again.
The classic. Alright, well, everyone knows what Bailey's in it. What is in Bailey's? God, I'm already drunk. What type of coffee are you drinking with the Baileys?
Oh, that's a good question. I have my favorite coffee brand, which is Tim Hortons. Unfortunately, where I live, there is no Tim Hortons, since I live in the SoCal area, and it's often a Canadian brand or is found along the northern states of America, where, you kind of border Canada. Mm-hmm. But I did get a bunch of these K-Cups. I made a huge order of 100, just to have a stash. And so yeah, probably drink 2 or 3 of these a day. And it doesn't beat the real thing, but it's the closest I can get while being away.
Yeah, I sort of think about it's not as good as sort of like when you go to a fast food place and getting the soda from the fountain versus getting the soda from a bottle or a can. It's not quite as good. That's what I'm kind of envisioning, where you just have this coffee that's not quite as good, but it still does the trick, and you still get enjoyment out of it.
Yeah, I definitely think it's the best alternative I can do.
Yeah, since you're not Canadian.
Or just live in a northern American state.
Well, I'm pretty north and close to Canada, but I don't even see them around here.
Oh, you don't?
No.
Interesting. I thought since Ohio has a bunch, that you guys might. Though Ohio's also a big hockey state, so maybe that also has something to do with it.
Also, I know that half of the Canadian population is pretty close to northwest, like New York. It's kind of close to that border between the U.S. and Canada, and so I don't know. I feel that might also have part to do with it, where it's Ohio is much closer to literally half the population of Canada.
Yeah, probably.
Maybe just hypothesizing.
Yeah, I'm looking up how many there are in Washington State, but why don't you tell me what you're drinking tonight while I do that?
Okay, so I was oh crap, I'm going to record tonight. At some point in the next few hours, I'm going to need to get some alcohol. What am I going to get? And I just happened to come across a farmer's market, and we were walking around, and one of the booths was for Greenwood Cider Company, and they had samples. So they had a person kind of talking about all the samples and letting you try them. I liked some of the samples, so I bought 2. One of them I'm drinking now, which is huckleberry flavor. It is an apple cider with huckleberries, and it's brewed here in Seattle, Washington, and it's very strong. It's almost 8% alcohol per volume, I feel pretty high for a apple cider. I am really enjoying this. I like just about anything huckleberry flavored. Like, it's kind of hard to go wrong with huckleberry. It's just so good.
Cool. Yeah, I'm not sure if I could, like, pinpoint what a huckleberry would taste like, but, like, I'm familiar with the flavor, though. I've definitely had, like, huckleberry pie before, or, like, a huckleberry jam, but, like, off the top of my head, it's not one that I could confidently say, like, oh, yeah, that's huckleberry.
Yeah. I can say that kind of rural places of, like, Washington, Idaho, and Oregon, like, picking huckleberries is, like, more commonplace amongst the average person. Like, every year, if it's the right season, people will pick huckleberries. They'll sell them to local, like, restaurants or something, and these local restaurants in these rural places will make, like, milkshakes or whatever, and it's just, like, a great time. It's, like, the one good thing about it.
Cool.
Yeah. Anyways, we've kind of been enjoying our side stories. Should we get into the main topic of this episode?
Yeah, let's start with some history on treasures so far. So, why don't you begin?
Alright, so just to make sure everyone's on the same page and everyone's up to speed, this kind of all begins a couple years back with gold tokens. So gold tokens are a token, specifically an artifact token, that said sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color. They came out in 2014, to be more specific, and they did not have the tap, like you could just sacrifice it and add the mana. So Wizards of the Coast thought that they were too strong because of the potential for gold to tap for 2 mana, because at the time they came out, they made a mana, and then the upcoming set had the mechanic improvise, and if I remember correctly, improvise means like you tap an artifact and it makes an additional mana just by tapping it.
Yeah, and that was, I think, especially apparent when Standard was released, that they realized, oh, if these gold tokens can just, double up on cards like Improvise, and Improvise is a pretty good mechanic that we could use moving forward, that would have a, effect on other formats that are eternal, like Legacy, Commander, Vintage. And I think shortly after they realized, okay, we're going to need to do something about that, is when they decided that they were going to have to make treasure tokens.
Yeah. So, really the only difference between gold and treasure is the fact that treasures have an additional cost of having to tap them. So that's the main difference. They, at the time... What am I trying to say? So, gold came out, WotC thought they were too powerful, so then they eventually, a couple years later, made treasures, and they're quote-unquote, weaker because they have to tap. That's basically the short story of it.
Yep.
Some more facts here is that, at the time of recording, there are about 170 treasure-related cards. Treasures first came out in 2017 in the Ixalan set, because they were first associated with pirates, and pirates are all about treasure and that booty, So, many of the treasure cards were concentrated in red, black, and blue, because that's what the colors of pirates were. So, in terms of a year-by-year breakdown, 2017 had 18 treasure cards. The next year, there were 7. Next year, there were 3. Next year, there were 7 again. Then the next year, so 2021, there was 58. So there's a noticeable increase. And then, the next year, in 2022, there was another increase up to 76. And that's where we're recording now. There's probably going to be more than 76, because there's still more cards that can come out this year.
Right.
Unfortunately, this podcast doesn't really have graphs to show it, but there was some at the beginning. It was pretty low in the next few years, and then it's been a sudden increase sharply the last 2 years or so.
Right. So we are in 2022 with 76 so far compared to 58 last year. We're about halfway through this year, so, there's potential that we could even reach 100. However, I think one of the few things that I tend to miss from other content creators when talking about treasures and their rise is, one, in 2022 is when we saw the beginning of commander decks kind of being printed into every deck, or with every set. So you have a increase in product, and with each of those decks there tends to be about 14 to 15 new cards.
Mm-hmm.
And so treasures are very popular in Commander, so probably at least 3 to 4 of those 15 are going to include treasures somehow, and will probably that'll probably continue to be the trend. And when you get like 2 to 5 decks with every set, that adds up pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Now, also with 2022, that's already like a significant increase already from the 58. Like, if we're just increasing a little every year, maybe we would only be halfway through there. But another thing, 2022, New Capenna, which just came out, was a 3-color set, and so, treasures, like at their core, are just meant to help be color fixing when you don't have that kind of mana available. And in a standard set, the best way to do that without just like breaking standard is by having treasures. So there had to be a lot of treasure cards in order to make standard work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I know, like, Morrow has said that treasures will be deciduous moving forward, which means that they most likely will be in every set. However, because of New Capenna and its, flavorfully too, treasures made sense in a crime world, and being a 3-colored set, there's just like an increased number of them. And then we also got 5 decks, which is more so than we get with most sets.
Mm-hmm.
Moving forward this year, we will continue to see some new treasure cards, but not nearly as many as we just got from New Capenna.
Right. That's all very, correct information that not a lot of other people have brought up, and I think we'll kind of elaborate more on later in this episode when we talk about questions of, are there too many treasure cards? What's the future of treasures? But for now, we're trying to hold ourselves back and just kind of talk about cold hard facts of this case. So, moving forward, another helpful way to think about treasures is how do they fit in terms of color pie philosophy. As of right now, and which colors are the best at token creation. So, primary is red. Secondary is black and green, and tertiary is blue. So I'm just going to quote the paragraph from the Mechanical Color Pie 2021 article. So, as the color of temporary mana, red is best at treasure creation. Black and green can both make treasure, but black tends to usually require some additional cost. Green historically has not had a lot of treasure making cards, but it's squarely in pie for green to do so. For flavor reasons like pirates, blue occasionally creates treasure. So, what do you have to add to that, guy?
I know that a lot of people are... I think there's 2 things. First, a lot of people are upset that green, being the color that already can create so much mana, is going to be secondary in treasure creation. A lot of people are upset about this because it just seems like green continues to get all the best things, like treasures. I don't know if I fully agree with that decision. It kind of makes sense, and the way that it's been explained to me is that green is supposed to be the color that can best fix your mana, and so I think their reasoning is because, since that's what green can do, treasures are the thing that we do use that for, we're going to make some green cards now moving forward that will create treasures. I know Bootlegger Stash just came out in New Capenna, and that's kind of what started a lot of this conversation, because they were like, wow, green is just, going crazy, getting some of the best cards to make treasures now. Like, you also had, like, Old Gnawbone, things like that. But we can talk a little bit more about that in the discussion. And then the other thing, too, is that, like, white is now left out of this, especially since, like, white has often had some of the best treasure-creating cards, and even has had some pretty good ones recently, like Battle Angels of Tears, Smuggler's Share, Master of Ceremonies. So, I think people are also upset that, like, white is not going to be able to get this, because it could also make sense for flavor reasons, and it's been a great way of being able to fix for commander decks. Or ramp, kind of, for white, specifically.
Exactly, and I agree with everything you just said. I just want to remind everyone listening that the color pie is rarely ever etched in stone. It's always sort of slightly bending and shifting over the years, and so who knows, in the next few years we might see white move up in the ranks, and we might see green move down in the ranks. That's a possibility. That's just speculation, though, but I don't want people to think that, this is just how things are, and I'm going to be mad about it forever, because, design will be taking feedback from the community over the next couple months and years, and see if there really is space within each color to maybe change whether they're primary, secondary, tertiary, or other.
Yeah, I think a good example, not to go off too much of a tangent, but drawing cards was never a ability that white could really do, just on the most rare of occasions, but with so much outcry from the fan base saying no, white really needs this somehow, they just made that kind of mechanic open to all the colors. And I think, if the community continues to speak to how they don't want as many green cards to make treasures, WotC would also take that into consideration, just like they did with white card draw, and say okay, we will add this kind of mechanic to every color, just who gets it most will be determined on by who needs it, or what will make one color stronger than the other.
Yeah. So, with that being said, we've kind of tried to be factual, and I'd like to kind of now move into the treasure discussion section of this video, where we're going to kind of talk about more of our opinions and thoughts. And so, just kind of seamlessly transitioning here, so we're still talking about the mechanical color pie, and how red is currently primary in treasure generation and sacrificing artifacts, so it makes sense that it's primary. I know Morrow has made a post on Blogatog. I believe the date is April 22nd, 2022, and it says, the point of the color pie is to limit who is good at what. Green is supposed to be primary in producing other colors of mana. Yes, it leans toward permanent fixes, which is why it's secondary in treasure. So this is sort of Morrow kind of defending why green does make as many treasures as it does, is because it's the color of making mana, basically.
Yeah, and I think that does make sense. I guess what just feels weird, I think, to some people is that green's often not the color to make artifacts, and I think people are having a hard time separating the functionality of what they're trying to do versus blue's primary in artifacts, or red is also pretty high in artifacts, but they're already primary here for treasures, so that just makes sense.
I have seen someone propose the idea that one way to mitigate that would be making treasure tokens that are more akin to more abstract ideas of treasure, instead of an actual chest with gold coins in it, instead it is a cornucopia filled with like fruits and vegetables and like plants, and to represent more of a nature's bounty sort of idea of treasure. I understand the point that's trying to make, but I think ultimately it still kind of clashes with it's still a subtype, or it's still like an artifact token, and artifice is inherently flavorfully not green.
Yeah, because artifacts are, often felt as
artificial,
being metal,
not nature,
not true to nature. Yes, so I think the function, definitely the functionality of what treasures wants to do is green. It's just, the hard part is separating that artifact aspect to it, and then it's you kind of just like think like, oh well, why not make something else? Like, why not be maybe, I don't know. They have done enchantment tokens, but like
they have.
I feel like that's weird to have enchantment tokens that would be like more flavorful to green. Like you could call them like petals or something, and then sacrifice those. But like then you're just adding essentially the same kind of token that is just a enchantment versus artifact, and I don't think they would do that. But I think that would help people get over that. Maybe, I don't know. It's just a hard thing to say.
Yeah, and I think whenever the discussion of treasures comes up, this is one of the main points. It's like, why is green making so many treasures, and why is white making so few? And I think people are kind of okay with how blue and red and black are being treated for treasure generation. It's just those two colors currently. So we'll see what comes of the future, because I know, like, believe it or not, like, a lot of WotC designers do listen to community feedback, and I wouldn't be too surprised if things change slightly for the better in the future.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm an optimist.
I agree. Our next kind of like bullet point here for like treasure discussion, and I have a lot of thoughts, but like kind of discussing like the adoption of like these extremely powerful treasure cards and just like how prominent they've become in the format. The two best examples are like Dockside Extortionist and Smothering Tithe. Both of these cards are just now synonymous with being like staples to their colors, and can just also be really annoying to play against. Dockside being a creature that'll create treasures equal to the number of artifacts, enchantments that all your opponents control, so it's essentially the best ritual because nobody's ever playing this and only making one treasure token. Like, most of the time people are playing this and just creating 7+ treasure, and that's just say, like... Yeah. It just seems like, oh god, like, the amount of mana you spend into Dockside Extortionist does not really equal what it should be making. And you got, like, Smothering Tithe, which is a card that just, like, triggers off of, like, the most common game interaction, which is drawing a card. And it's that constant, like, are you paying 2? Are you paying 2? Like, it's just annoying. And then, like, it does give also a pretty big advantage to whoever is then making those treasures.
What's interesting to me is that there are about 200-ish treasure cards at this point in time, but only, like, at least for the Commander format, there's only, like, 5 to 10 that see, like, a high amount of play. As you said, like, Dockside Extortionist and Smothering Tithe. So it's interesting to me where it's, like, there's all these, like, people, like, play Commander, and they think that treasures are way more prevalent than they actually are, because when you do the math, it's like, oh, it's only actually like a few treasure cards that are just seeing tons of play, because most, as of right now, most treasure cards, they're just kind of mediocre, because they're actually adequately costed for whatever effect they are. And so I think right now, that's one of the most interesting things to me, where people are really concerned about treasures, but, like, I'd say 97% of them are like not even an issue or even a concern at all. It's just like literally like a handful of cards that are like skewing the perception of treasures.
Yeah, like treasures are a problem because more so just like these 3 specific cards. Well, I don't see why, these 3, like most of these cards aren't really a problem, but you just have these 3. So I think it's more of a discussion of like, it's not really the mechanic, it's just these 3 cards are so extremely powerful for what they should be doing. Maybe they're a problem, not just like one mechanic. It's kind of, well, I guess I don't want to bring Dredge into this because I don't think Dredge is nearly as bad of a problem as Treasures. But yeah, I just feel like sometimes there's one card that stands out that really abuses a certain mechanic, and can kind of be, this is actually a great leading point into this next card, Hull Breacher, which was banned in Commander back in July 2021. So, Hull Breacher, if anyone doesn't remember, I'm going to remind you real quick, was a Merfolk Pirate. It cost 2 blue. It came out in the Commander Legends set. It has Flash, and if an opponent would draw a card, except the first one they draw in each of their draw steps, instead you create a treasure token. And it's like, holy cow, that's such a good card. We were like going nuts over it when Commander Legends came out. And so I don't think the problem with Hull Breacher was necessarily that it was creating you treasures, but it was just, also being tied into other cards like Wheel of Fortune, Wheel of Misfortune, where you would get all your opponents to not draw cards, which is kind of essential to the game, but then you also get to just make a bunch of treasures and like run off with the game. So I think people weren't really seeing like, oh yeah, it's the treasures. Well, no, it's more so they can't do a basic game function.
They basically don't get to draw cards anymore the rest of the game.
Right, and so that's just what makes this card crazy. And, they appropriately were able... I feel like even in their explanation, they weren't saying, like, treasures is the problem with this card. It's like, no, it's actively stopping your opponents from playing cards. Like, this card would also be really annoying to play against if it didn't even create treasure tokens. Or, like the treasure tokens came in tapped. I don't know. It's not like that's what makes this card so bad to play against. It's the fact that you can't draw cards. So where was I going with this? Yeah, so I feel like treasures are getting kind of like wrapped up in some of these cards that are just so disproportionately good to like how much they cost, which is kind of what makes them like quote unquote staples. That yeah, they were like, oh yeah, treasures are with that card, which is just so good. Well, no, it wasn't the treasures. So yeah.
Yeah, I am currently rereading the July 2021 Rules Committee announcement and looking at Hull Breacher being banned. And it does not even mention treasures in this statement as to why it was banned. It's literally just about locking out your opponents from drawing cards. So that's a bit of perspective for you.
Yeah, so I feel like part of the reason they're like, yeah, that treasure's so good, Hull Breacher was even banned, like, no. So, I guess, like, what I'm trying to say is, like, Hull Breacher, like, when we're going back to, like, are treasures good, or, like, are some treasure cards too powerful? I mean, some of them are, but also, like, I think people are going crazy for, like, Hull Breacher. But yeah, that wasn't the problem.
Yeah. So, next up is a point that I hear a lot, which is people online saying there needs to be an answer to treasures. Like, we need to start playing treasure hate cards in every deck. Cards like Viridian Revels, Null Rod, Collector Roof, Kataki's War's Wage, and Magnetic Mine. Some of these cards I knew of beforehand, and some of these cards I had not heard of, and I'm like, really? You're gonna play like Magnetic Mine just to like hate on treasures? That is an incredibly interesting statement. I have a lot of thoughts about this. Guy, do you want to say yours first?
Yeah, so first, if treasures truly are a problem in your meta, and if we go back to what we were just kind of saying, like, there are at best 10 cards that make treasures that are like worth playing. So if you think about how often you see some of those cards in your games, like, yeah, you maybe see it once, maybe twice per like 2 to 4 games you play, then, you know, it's not really worth it to like run some of these cards that, you know, might have an impact when you could just be playing cards that are going to actually help your deck. But anyway, and there's also just better options in general, like Blind Obedience, Karn, the Great Curator, Stony Silence. You have Null Rod and Collector Oof, which are very similar to Stony Silence, which are, I'd say, the best ones also to run, just because, like, those are general cards that just stop artifacts. Viridian's Revels is, like, artifacts going to the graveyard, and if you think about artifacts going to the graveyard, it's like, yeah, you got treasures and, like, Commander Sphere, and now I'm kind of running out. Yeah. I don't know. I don't think it's necessarily worth it for people to start running treasure-specific hate when you could just be running, like, artifact hate in general. But yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think people should panic and start playing specifically treasure hate cards. I think that is the sort of mentality that leads to, like, quote-unquote arms races within, like, people's small playgroups, where someone plays, like, Dockside or Smothering Tithe, and then you're like, okay, well, in order to combat this, I'm gonna, like, tech in Viridian Revels and Collector Oof and Mikataki's Ward's Wage into my Selesnya deck. They might not synergize with my deck, but it's just gonna be hating on you, and because I'm so tired of your Dockside Extortionist winning you all these games. And then going back to that person, they're like, well, okay, well, I'll just make my deck more powerful. And, like, then it goes back and forth, and then suddenly there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of hatred amongst players, and it's not necessarily a healthy way of solving issues. So I do not advise people to start taking in treasure hate, because A, I don't think it's healthy, and I don't think it's necessary. Another point I'd like to say is, like, I think I'd run graveyard hate over treasure hate. Generally speaking, like, there are so many deck strategies that rely on the graveyard more than I would say that than there are decks in Commander that rely on treasures to win, that, like, I would run graveyard hate before I run treasure hate, which is saying something, because I'm, like, there's a lot of Commander players out there that insist that graveyard hate needs to be in every single deck you play, and I do not subscribe to that philosophy at all, so for me to say that should say something.
Yeah, I mean, unless if you know specifically someone in your meta relies on that, like, yeah, if, like, someone is specifically in your meta, I guess, creating a lot of treasures, and you want to tech in, like, maybe 1 to 2 cards, just because you know that you play with them that often, that, like, you know, maybe it's going to be, like, a ace in your hole, like, I think that's okay, but, like, just in general, if you're trying to play against specifically treasure hate, that you're gonna have a little more toughness, because tough time, because if you don't have that one card on handy, then it's kind of worthless, and especially if, like, nobody's playing treasures, you still want specifically more, like, cards that are going to be good against artifacts in general.
Oh, can I tell you a quick story?
Oh, yes, please.
Okay, so a couple years back, I was, like, living pretty rural, and it's like, alright, it's the weekend, like, I have nothing to do, so I drove into the city, I found a game store, and I'm like, hey, can I just spend, like, the rest of the evening, like, sorting through, like, your bulk? And they're like, sure. So, like, I was, like, I probably spent about 5 hours just, like, shuffling through, like, bulk, like, looking for, like, the occasional card or two that I'm like, hey, like, I'd actually spend money on this, I'll buy this. And one of them was Viridian Revels. And I was like, ooh, like, this is sort of like it's a enchantment, and it does something that, like, kinda does something relevant and draws you cards. Yeah, I'll buy this foil. And I think it was, like, $1. And then now I think a foil version is about, like, $30.
Oh, wow.
And so I'm just like, wow, look at me.
I mean, you
I
can
lucked
sell
out.
it if you're not going to use it.
No, like, are you kidding me? That baby's just gonna go up in value.
Okay. Yeah, that's a pretty good, like, find. But it's kind of just ironic that, like, now you have that, too, and you're also saying, like, don't play this card.
I'm not even gonna play it. I've never played it yet.
Right. Okay. So, I've seen this point be brought up, and it's silly to me because I have a lot of thoughts. But treasure tokens, this is a comparison that is made quite often. Treasure tokens are Lotus Pedals, and they should be treated and assessed accordingly. I think it's really like they do the same thing. Lotus Pedal is a 0 mana card that says tap, sacrifice, add 1 mana of any color. So it's like, yeah, it's just a treasure token. I don't know. And so Lotus Pedal is. So I guess I don't know what I'm trying to say, but like, so they're not the same because Lotus Pedal is a spell that does trigger your storm count, unlike treasures, which makes Lotus Pedal like a little better. And also, unlike treasures, it does take a place in your deck, but that also means that Lotus Pedal can be abused since once it's sacked, it goes to the graveyard, unlike treasure tokens, which would just get exiled. So yeah, Lotus Pedal is just a really good card, and I think it's weird that like, you know, people are comparing treasure tokens to this really good card because it's like, no, I'd rather, I guess, run Lotus Pedal over like a majority of the cards that do make treasures. Like, they're not the same.
Yeah, like, I'll be honest, I'm sort of in the middle of this, where I see the similarities, I see the differences. This is kind of a large discussion that, like, I could probably talk about for another half hour if I really wanted to. But I think the one thing I will say is kind of perceiving treasure tokens as Lotus Petals can be helpful in certain circumstances. Like I'll play Commander games, and someone will get out their Smothering Tithe, and they'll always be asking, do you pay the 2? Do you pay the 2? Do you pay the 2? And oftentimes people will be like, no. And so they'll start accumulating a lot. They'll put out like a token or a piece of paper, and then they'll put a dice on it, and they'll like spin up the dice, and just the physicality of that, I think, isn't quite as obvious. I think people don't realize, like, oh, that D20 over there that has a 10, that means they have 10 mana over there. I feel like, especially if you like politic and like present yourself in a certain way, like you can kind of undermine just how much mana you're making. And so I feel like reminding yourself that, hey, this person basically has 10 Lotus Petals over there, kind of can be helpful. Does what I'm saying make sense?
I think in that sense, like, yeah, it does kind of scare you if you're like essentially getting to put down a Lotus Petal every turn. But I guess it's hard to also then separate just that Lotus Petal is a actual card.
Yes, there are differences. Yeah.
Right, and that's what I guess, like, yeah, I guess it's, again, the mana that I'm more scared of, not so much that it's, I guess, this certain specific card, which they're just equating to be Lotus Petal. So I guess, like, no, I get you're making a lot of mana, that's true, but, like, Lotus Petal is a card, so I guess I just more agree with it as a... I disagree with it as a statement, but, like, agree with the sentiment. Now, I don't know if that even makes sense.
I think it does. I think it really depends on whether people are perceiving treasure tokens appropriately as a threat in the Commander format, and like if they're not, telling them, oh, well, try perceiving it as Lotus Petals, then maybe that'll help them get closer to an accurate assessment of treasure tokens.
Yeah, I think thinking about it in the Lotus Petals sense, it's like just hard because, like, again, spells, storm count, like, much more abusable as a card, but, like, you know, they are doing the same thing of making mana.
Alright, next point. I feel like you have stronger opinions about this, but I see all the points that you're about to make. So treasure cards either have, like, the token generation tacked onto a card, like a bonus. So think of like Deadly Dispute versus other cards that have the token generation as like the main focus, like Dockside or Stormkiln Artist. So you have a handy side-by-side comparison here in our notes. So Costly Plunder is 1 and a black. It's an instant that says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice an artifact or creature. Draw 2 cards. And then later on, there was this card called Deadly Dispute, which is the exact same card, except after drawing the 2 cards, you also create a treasure token. So it's basically the same card, except better, in 99% of all circumstances.
Yeah, I would struggle, I guess, to think of an instance where I wouldn't want to play this kind of card. Where I wouldn't want to play Deadly Dispute for Costly Plunder. Like, I guess if I'm scared because one guy's making so many treasures and my opponent does have treasure hate for some reason, like, yeah, I guess I won't make the 1 treasure. But I think, just in general, though, reprinting cards that are, like, essentially functional reprints, but just adding create a treasure token can be problematic moving forward, especially if that's just going to be what treasure becomes. If it's just something that, like, can be done from... I guess I just don't want to erase so many cards just to then, like, have them also create treasure tokens, because then it's going to be... Then, like, yeah, I think we'll start getting into the problem where, like, treasure will actually be a problem, because it's just printed on so many cards that are just better versions of already staples. So if you're, if I took one deck that has, if I just said then, like, every card has a new version where it can also create a treasure token, it's like, okay, yeah, now I'm going to have to change all my cards in my deck to just also be these new versions with treasure tokens, which, yeah, would just become a problem. That's a little extreme, though, but that's, yeah, kind of the problem that we could run into.
It's just like, hey, WotC, if you make a new card, make sure if you make a new treasure card, don't make it a quote-unquote strictly better version of a previous card. Like Deadly Dispute versus Costly Plunder example.
Yeah, like either make it a sorcery or make it an extra mana. Because it really just now reads like Deadly Dispute black. Because you get back a mana. And you can also filter that mana.
Mm-hmm. Alright, so I would like to now move into what I would argue is the 3 main questions that we've kind of been tiptoeing around this whole episode when it comes to discussing treasures. So now that we've kind of laid the foundation, both in facts and opinions, are treasures being printed too frequently? We talked about how year by year there's more and more cards being printed that have treasures. Is this a problem?
So, I think I originally wrote my response before knowing a little bit about why there were so many treasures printed so far this year. But I guess, so what I'm going to say is, are treasures being printed too frequently? I'm going to say, at this rate, yes. I wouldn't mind slowing down on treasures, but I don't want them to become a necessary part of higher power commander games where we're just again, reprinting cards that are strictly better versions because they tacked on the create a treasure token aspect.
Mm-hmm.
But I do also understand, sometimes it is necessary to make treasure cards for the sake of other formats, I guess, because they are just such a useful tool to R&D's disposal.
Yeah, my response to our treasures being printed too frequently, I would say, given current trajectory, yes, but I am optimistic based on a few statements certain WotC staff have made that basically says they've heard the community and their concerns about treasure and how it's going to kind of level off as to how many treasures are going to be made. It's not like in 2024 we're going to get 550 treasure cards, that they're like, alright, we've heard you, we're going to kind of chill out and level off here. And hopefully they're not gonna like overwhelm the format to like an actual overwhelming degree.
Yeah, I think it's just kind of like, again, for this year, that it was kind of necessary for new Capenna, and then we also had like 5 new Capenna decks, so the abundance goes up, but that's not going to be the case year by year. So I would be like, if this is like the max number we would receive every year, I guess that's kind of fine. But I don't even think like this is going to be. This is like even above what like the normal median max will be, because I feel like moving forward we will see a decrease in treasures. It's just kind of in the moment right now. It feels like there's so many.
Absolutely. All right. So another question that is core to this discussion that we've kind of been tiptoeing around is, which colors should have access to treasures? Guy, what are your thoughts?
Okay. If it were up to me, red would be primary in treasures, and I would move green down to tertiary, and I would move white into secondary. So I would make sure that this is something that all colors can do, because I think that, adding mana to your mana pool is kind of a necessary part to make the game continue. So
like drawing cards.
Yeah. So it is something that all colors should have access to. It's just like which ones need it the most, and I think blue can abuse it the most, being an artifact, and green takes advantage of just having more mana. So while I understand that, green can have access to treasures, I just don't feel like it should be secondary. And like white, again, we were in a period where we were saying like, oh, white doesn't have any way of like catching up. Treasures are a good way of being able to stockpile and create mana, which is why it should be able to do that when it's not going to be able to do something else like get you lands. But I guess if, maybe that is where the trajectory they might have for that is, because we have gotten cards like Deep Known Terramancer as an example recently, so like maybe that's something. I don't know.
I pretty much agree with you in terms of like how you would re-rank the color identities for primary, secondary, tertiary. I feel like what you're saying makes sense. I think we're perfectly aligned in this issue. We'll see what actually happens. I think about, Mark Rosewater used to be in charge of the Color Pie article, but then it's kind of grown too big for just him to handle. So now there's the, what's it called?
The Council of Colors?
Yes, thank you. The Council of Colors. So now it's a one person directed on each color. And so every couple years, they re-release an article stating all of the current state of like which colors can do what, and which mechanics are primary, secondary, and tertiary for each color. And so who knows? Maybe in a couple years we'll get a revision of that article.
It is definitely something that is ever changing, so this is just up for debate in the future.
Alright, the final major question in discussing treasures that, again, we've kind of been tiptoeing around is, are treasures too powerful? Guy, what do you think?
So, I think, at the moment, no. But I do also, again, going back to the point, they are something that, like, every color needs to have. So, again, if you think about the number of treasure cards there are, which is, we said about 200, and you kind of just, like, make a chart showing, like, power level on a scale of, like, 1 to 10, like, where do some of these land? You have, like, 3 or 4 that land in the 10 section, and that's where, like, main focus of discussion tends to be, like, these cards are too powerful, because... No shit, like, yeah, these are the 3 best examples you can give, but there is a significant number of other treasure cards that aren't nearly as good as this.
Mm-hmm.
So I think kind of just skewing towards the best examples of anything is not a good way of indicating whether or not something's too powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah. So where I stand on are treasures too powerful, one thing I like to think about is thinking from the competitive EDH perspective, in which the best treasure card for that end of the format is Dockside Extortionist. Not even a question. And a lot of very smart, incredibly talented CEDH players have talked about whether or not Dockside should be banned, and that's its own can of worms. But the oversimplified conclusion of that discussion is no, it's super powerful and it is format defining. It is very strong, similar to ad nauseum at that end of the format, but it's okay as far as being one of like the most powerful cards at that end of the format. So, like, is it too powerful? Like, does it need to be banned out of this format? Like, at least from the CDH perspective, like, arguable, but no. In terms of the slightly more casual perspective, like, is it ruining casual play? That's also a very big discussion, but I currently would say no. Like, it's a powerful card, but, like, is it ban-worthy? Like, as someone who approaches the Commander ban list with the philosophy of ban as few cards as possible and only ban the truly, like, utterly most broken bullshit there is, like, no. Like, we're fine so far. Who knows what WotC will print in the future? Nobody really knows, but at least at time of recording, we're fine. Everyone just take a deep breath, we're gonna be okay.
Yeah, and I even, like, kind of, are treasures too powerful? Like, part of your discussion there wasn't even so much focused on, like, the treasure aspect. It was also just focused, again, on that, like, Dockside card is kind of the problem.
Yeah.
Which goes back to what I was saying. Exactly. Like, it's not so much that, like, treasures are the problem. This one specific card is just so good, and, maybe the whole ban-worthy thing is, like, a whole other discussion, but, like, yeah, it's not the treasures, it just happens to be on, like, a super good card that is better at doing and making that thing than, like, most other cards that do the thing.
Yeah.
Which is make treasures.
It's like an individual card versus, like, an actual mechanic debate where it's like, if Dockside Extortionist cost 5 or 6 mana, would we really be having this discussion? Probably not. It's sort of like this, like, talking about the storm scale and whether a mechanic is actually, like, where it is on that storm scale. And it's different depending on what format you're on. That's kind of own little side discussion, but overall, I'm not too worried. I think we're going to be okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not worried either.
Mm-hmm. So, that being said, last major section of this episode, where do we go from here? What is the future of treasures? So, the first non-token treasure to be printed was Mimic in Adventures of the Forgotten Realm. And, Guy, you reminded me that there were, like, more cards that were treasure cards that weren't just the tokens printed after that.
Yeah, so the big difference is, like, okay, treasures, maybe not always having to be tacked onto a card, but can be, like, a card subtype, similar to, like, how we have sagas occasionally, as, like, different enchantment types. Treasures can just kind of be tacked onto cards that are artifacts that can then also be used as treasures. So, Mimic is a creature, but tacked on, you can also say, like, sacrifice, add a mana of any color. So we've also gotten Treasure Hound and Glittering Stockpile, which are artifacts that are treasures, but they also do cost mana to play, but can buy themselves back eventually. Which I think these are, like, neat and interesting ways of expanding treasures, if we don't just want to make them just, like, straight up add-ons to cards we already have, and adding them to, like, artifact creature tokens would be a great solution as well, since then, being a creature, you can't automatically just then sack itself, because it has summoning sickness. So, like, creature treasures, I think, is a interesting way that we could expand upon treasures, but without, like, breaking treasures.
I agree. In terms of mixing subtypes, like, whenever you make an enchantment and then you make it an enchantment creature, or you take an artifact and make it an artifact creature, in most circumstances, you're almost always making it more vulnerable to removal, because there's more removal spells. Like, you could counter that by saying like, oh, well, by making it a creature, you're also opening it up to more synergies depending on the deck. But overall, I'd say like you're making it more vulnerable. So I am okay with seeing treasure tokens being opened up into being treasure creatures. I think it'll be okay if we see more of them.
Yeah, I agree.
Alright, the last point we have here is another Blogatog post by Mark Rosewater, and this one is dated June 27th, 2022. Again, in case y'all want to check these references that we're making. So this is sort of one of those if or when questions that Maro often gets asked. It's like ask a question, is this more of a matter of when this will happen, like maybe years in the future, or if, as in yes or no, this is not going to happen at all. So the question is, treasure variants that can only add one color, question mark? And Maro's answer is, if. We tried it in the vision design of an upcoming set, and it had a bunch of issues. So that's a pretty short answer, but it has kind of a lot of implications, where they've taken, we start with gold, and now we're moving into treasure, and now people are asking if treasure is too strong, at least in Commander. I feel like it's the only format people are asking if treasures are too strong, but nevertheless, that question is being asked, and now we're being asked, like, hey, can we nerf treasures by making them only add one color of mana? And now, here's Maro saying, we tried it in various experiments, and it has issues. I don't know what those issues are. He doesn't say. I wish he did. But it sounds like it's not a thing that's going to be happening in the future.
Yeah, I guess I am very interested to know, like, what exactly those issues were, because it's like, does somehow making that treasure, like, tap for one specific color of mana make it, like, extremely better? Were you just having, like, play issues with it? Like, I'm really struggling to, like, figure out, is this a problem because you're trying to avoid it before it happens, or is it a problem that you just think isn't worth pursuing?
I imagine that it probably has something to do with, like, we tried it, and in Standard, it didn't allow for the color fixing that current treasures allow for, so it caused mana fixing issues. I am purely speculating here, as someone who plays Magic exclusively through the lens of Commander, but that's what I am guessing here. If anyone has more insights to this, please comment below, like, let us know. I would love to know. I'm going to listen to Mark Rosewater's podcast, Drive to Work, and see if he happens to talk about this in the future.
I feel like we'll eventually get to know this, because if he talks about a set in the future, he can go back on this point of like, oh, we did try this in Vision Design, and it didn't work for X, Y, Z reasons. Like, I feel like part of the reason why he can't tell us now is because it's confidential to
a certain set.
Some kind of set. Yeah.
Alright, so those are the three main questions. You kind of have some closing thoughts here?
Yes. So, I just want to say, like, in my mind, I don't mind treasures. You know, the big issue with these is more like they are just tied to extremely powerful cards, but the issue there is more so those cards are just, again, format defining. I feel like it's kind of ironic, but like, Bootlegger Stash, which I think is another good example of what people are saying is like too good of a treasure card. I actually think like making cards like Bootlegger Stash is like a pretty good solution, since it costs a lot of mana, 6 mana. So like, sure, you could get to green in that pretty easily. You can't immediately use the mana, or like, okay, sorry. I think people are thinking of it too much as like it's a mana doubler, but in order to do that, you need several other cards handy to then do that. So it just kind of becomes part of a combo. It's just not necessarily a good card on its own. So that's why I'm like, okay, yeah, like that's an interesting way of creating treasures. You can easily like color fix your lands. Like that's what it's trying to do flavorfully for New Capenna.
Yes.
Is that they're not just being like, oh no, it's doubling your mana. It's like, no, that's not exactly the case. But so, yeah, I think in order to make Bootlegger Stash really good, Seaboard Muse, Wilderness Reclamation, or a card that will like double some of your treasures like Sorn or Jolene. Yeah, so just all these examples of like cards to make Bootlegger Stash good, whereas just like cards as Dockside and Smothering Tithe are just good on their own already. You don't need another card on the field. Like, some of those examples, like, it would be great if those cards were on the field, but like, they're just good on their own. Printing less cards like that is kind of the solution, and cards more like Bootlegger Stash are kind of a medium ground. Like, it's a good card, kind of, when paired with other cards, but like, it's just not, it's like, falls into the 6 to 7 power level discussion of like treasure cards, but like, yeah, Smothering Tithe and Dockside are like way ahead of it. So less cards like that, more cards that are like in the medium power level range for treasures.
I think that Dockside Extortionist and Smothering Tithe have already been printed. Like, this is an internal format, so they're just in the format now. But I'm hoping that going forward, WotC's heard various criticisms and critiques from the community, and they continue to make most treasure cards properly costed, or even overcosted, I should say. And people kind of lose their anxiety and concerns about treasure cards, and that hopefully one day this discussion about our treasures ruining Commander, overall this discussion is going to kind of fade into the background, and we can focus on like other issues, I suppose. I'm optimistic.
Yeah. I feel like it's just kind of being brought to the point more recently because of this shift in seeing green cards that can make treasures, and just there being so many recently.
Yeah.
But I don't think that this is going to be an issue
like 2 or 3 or 4 years in the future. Hopefully not.
I mean, I feel like it'll always be a topic of discussion, but I don't think it's going to be a problem, I guess. Like, the format will adjust accordingly.
Alright.
I mean, let us know your thoughts, I guess, on treasures.
If you're like, no, this is ruining the format, we're all gonna die, we're all screwed, please comment below.
I mean, I don't know, like, I'm kind of curious, like, what our fan base would think if they're like, what the fuck? Like, these guys are, like, totally off the rockers. No, treasures are terrible, but I don't know.
Yeah, I would love that, honestly. Alright, so thank you all so much for listening. Guy and I have had a blast talking about this topic. You're gonna see more episodes sort of like this as we are slowly waning off set review style episodes. We're trying to do more episodes that are more discussion based like this. Give us our feedback on whether or not you want to see that sort of thing. But regardless, we are the Wizard Staff Podcast. You can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Make sure to leave a like and review. It actually really does help us out. And make sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter at WizardStaff101. And you can also send us an email at thewizardstaff101@gmail.com if you want to bitch and complain about how stupid we are. Thank you so much for listening again, and we hope you have a great night. Peace out.
Peace.